And so glad everyone's here. If you want to, you can go ahead and open your minds. The Bibles will be open second, but we're certainly going to be involved in the scriptures quite a bit this morning and throughout the course of this class for the next 52-ish weeks or so. It's all structured out that way. But before we do that, if you would open your hearts in prayer with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time that we'll share together and study. We thank you for the place where we worship, its safety and accommodations. We hope that we use the blessings that you have given us to your glory and to your good. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so we've got a couple things to hand out at the start of class. You also may have gotten a copy of this in your emails. But we'll start off with this. James, would you do me a favor and pass out these to everybody? And then Carson, since you're right there, and I can keep teaching while you're doing it. It's 2 pages each for these. So there's a single page and then like that. So it's be 3 pages total, but 2 pieces of paper. So don't get nervous, but James is handing out a quiz. It's not one that will be graded by anybody other than you, and we'll grade it and do that quiz maybe midway through our class this morning. And Carson is handing out a copy of the course syllabus for the semester / quarter / year / everything, because our schedule is broken up by a couple of things. That's why I wanted that all there. First thing it's broken up by is we have our gospel meeting towards the end of the calendar year that will be on a date to be determined, and so there's an accommodation for that. Second thing that will take place in the middle of the series is that we'll take a break from this class to have an 8-week series that is a contemporary connection to our summer series. And so while we're having that summer series on Thursday nights, we're going to have our own 8-lesson special Bible class to kind of match it, to increase our retention and participation of that material in the class there too. So you'll notice there's a 8-week gap, if you will, in the middle of the series. But right now, let's talk a little bit about our primary focus for the class, not just the scheduling stuff, all that's in the note. Reminder there for the coursework in the class and all of that. You'll have some suggestions on there. In the email that was sent out Thursday, it included options if you would like to get a copy of the entire source book for some of the material here. And there's 2 options. Option number 1 is you can download a copy of the entire thing straight from that email. So if you want that, it's an option number 1. If you prefer the tactile physical experience of having a book in your hand, there's a link for that in that email too. And so you can go to Amazon and get a copy of the entire workbook. And this is the old edition. This is my original edition of this thing that I brought with me to class this morning. And so if you want to see what that would look like, then the only change between this and the current one is the cover. The content and the material on the inside is exactly the same. You're more than welcome to look at it. It's available for you to decide, hey, do I want that? Do I not want that? But if you decide to do option 1 or option 2 or option 3, which is to try to go on your own and use your own library, it's a fine option. I don't recommend it. It's a lot of extra work. I will be handing out in the course of the class anyway all the maps that we're going to use. And so you're still going to get your map work either way. And the first map will be handed out next week. That means that you'll have some assignments in that map where you've got to get something really special. You got to choose how you're going to color. So you can color with pen if you're really confident. Don't recommend that. You can color with pencil, and they make erasable colors, pencils. Recommend that choice. That's my kind of space. Or anything else. You can do paint. You can do Crayolas. If you want to use pens, Crayolas, sand and dust. That's awesome. This is an opportunity to get some physical connection to the studying that we're doing to try to make it stick in a different way. And so map work is not just about making sure you know how to get from where you are to where you want to go. In this case, it's going to be an essential component to taking all these Bible stories that we're very familiar with and giving them a place, giving them a setting, giving them some history to it. So there'll be some photos I'll bring up from time to time of some of the archaeological sites that exist. Some of the things that we'll read about and study have not changed at all since the time that the events the Bible records took place. So most of the waterway stories, the physicality of lakes, rivers, and streams, those are pretty consistent in these stories. And so we can say this is the spot. This is an unchanged part. Again, more than welcome to look at that. You can use the online version. You can get your own printed version. Participate in the way that matches your learning style as part of this, because we all learn differently. But the schedule is in that note, so you kind of know where we're going with it. Today, we begin to look at all of this. And I think it's important for us to have a little bit of pre-knowledge. That is, things that we need to kind of set as a standard for us to be able to have these discussions, using the scriptures in part to establish these ideas. Important to recognize that God built us with the ability to reason. If you start looking around and try to factor in what makes humanity different than the rest of breathing creation, one of the things that comes up, I think it's the second most important thing, not the most important, is man's ability to reason. Animals, by the way, do have intellect to their own degrees. We see that when they make independent choices. That's why it's not the most distinguishing thing between humanity and created breathing kind. But it is a big one. Our capacity to function intellectually supersedes the rest of creation. By the way, what the most important thing is that we share likeness with God. We have a soul that distinguishes us from the rest of creation in that regard. But because we have intellect, God routinely, in his revelation to us, expects us to think. He expects us to reason, to consider, to engage with him using what has been given to us. And here's a way to think about that because of those contexts. When you think about the people that you know, your relationships, your connections with others, those interactions, it changes the way you perceive them when you get a better appreciation of their life setting and experiences. If you listen to someone talk all the time about the place they grew up, and then you go there and you see where they grew up, all those stories sit a little differently, right? Like, oh, there's your favorite restaurant. Oh, that's the place where you used to work. You sat here to go to school? I was talking to Les and Linda about the history of the congregation here last week. In particular, the place the church has met. And I think the winner in number of places is a house that's been remodeled. Is that the most common solution? Like 3 or 4 homes that got remodeled of different sizes. Then storefronts. And this is the only building, right? So that matches out. So I encourage you to not talk to me about that, but talk to them and the other members of the congregation here who have been here a long time. They can tell you some stories about some of these places. Some of them are quite interesting. The question you need to ask, if you did not have a long connection with the church here, is the lazy donkey. Is that right? The lazy donkey. And so that's the story that will give you some interesting tidbits. Let's just say, what's lazy donkey? It's a good story. And actually, I think it's one that would be a good icebreaker in the future for different opportunities. So now everyone can swarm Les and Linda, and then Les and Linda can blame me for that. But these kind of things accomplish that for us. And so in order to get a great understanding of the Bible, then we need to make sure some of these things kind of lay out that way. man has then used that intellect across all the spaces of his life. And in that context, you think about how this functions. In thinking about first the garden. The garden was a place where God expected mankind to use their intellect to function. Unfortunately, that intellect also comes with free will. God gave man a law. Mankind failed to keep that law. They broke it. And intellect sometimes causes conflict between what God hopes for us and what we choose for us. A phrase that I sometimes say, especially working with some of the younger parts of the Boy Scout crowd, when I come in and I see the mess they've made, the comment I made, choices were made. So they created their own chaos. They made those choices. And now they got to unclutter their circumstances and fix themselves to reconcile the outcome. Well, that's how we are too. Our lives are often a function of the choices we've made. Well, if we think about it even more so, back in this context of how the law functions, think about this. The Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, interchangeable terms there, is perhaps more so than just the books that we call history books, a history book. It is not a science book. It's not exactly a rule book per se. It's mostly history. And even inside some of the prophetic books, the prophets, they tell histories too. And so the bulk of it is history. And it shows things like, and Isaiah and Jeremiah kind of clearly state that, man is not capable on their own of rescuing themselves. That's a hard point to accept at different places in your life, right? That you need help. When you're little, everything is given to you and provided for you in the best of circumstances. As you mature, you tend to think, well, now I'm self-sufficient, self-sustaining. And then you might eventually kind of launch from your house in some way or another, and you've figured it all out. And then at some point or another, that kind of fantasy is going to get shattered, where you realize you can't do it all on your own. That happens earlier with spiritual things than we think. There's a spiritual crisis that will take place within us that's different than our physical circumstances. And I want to read these 4 passages in particular this morning before we get any further. So, Rich, could you read for me Jeremiah 10:23? And then, hey, Bill, could you do me a favor and read Isaiah 55:8? And we'll pause there before we read some more.
Jeremiah 10:23. I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself, that it is not in man who walks to direct his steps.
Bill?
For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord.
Let me put some context that helps me think through what all those 2 passages kind of entail. At some point, your parents probably said something like, because I said so, as a reason for a decision, right? You ever hear that from your parents? When talking to parents, they all say eventually that's the answer. Because on the other end of the spectrum, we as human beings always feel like we have a right to know why a thing is happening and why a decision is being made. That is something universal to the experience of humanity, is that for some reason, we always feel like we got a right to know why a thing's being done. Even if the thing that's being done has absolutely nothing to do with us. Well, I want to know. Why'd you do that? Why are you doing that to me? I didn't do a thing to you. Like, you're not even part of this business. You were just walking by. We got to know. So we understand that on the human side, that sometimes the answer is, because I said so. It doesn't mean there's no reasons. It just means that the reasons aren't going to be shared. They may not be relevant. They may not be any of your business. They actually may supersede at the moment your need or ability to understand. It may not be necessary. So as an example of some of those things on the human side before we shift into the spiritual side, think about this. If I am trying to rescue you and you are drowning, you're literally no longer able to keep yourself above the water. Do I need to explain to you why it is that I need to roll you over because you're fighting me and you're about to punch me, and I might choose to just simply physically take you into my possession and rescue you? Do I need to explain that? Do you realize every time I try to rescue someone, they want me to tell them why I'm doing the things that I'm doing and how I'm doing it? Like, it's really actually a pretty common thing. And the more you panic, you know what happens? The less reasonable and logical you become. Now, eventually you reach a point where the panic is so large, you're just so thankful that the person's there and you shut up and they rescue you. But there's that middle space where everyone wants to know, why are you doing that? Because you're dying. I'm not dying. Yes, you're dying. If I don't do this, you're going to die. That's just kind of the cycle there. Spiritually, it's the same kind of thing. Same kind of symptomatic occurrence where we believe we know what we need to do. And God says, first in our first two passages, actually, I don't think that's the case. You don't see the world like God does. We don't see the world like God does. And a lot of times, our desire to know puts us in direct conflict with what God needs us to do, to see, or to understand. And sometimes the Bible answer to a lot of questions that I have or you may have is, sorry, I said so. And often we don't even get the sorry. It's just, I have declared. Humanity wants to make an excuse for not telling the person why, but God doesn't often do that. He just says, this is how it is. We're not going to read the entirety of the 68 verse section of Deuteronomy, but it's there for our learning. It does exist there for us. Otherwise, we'd need to spend a good amount of time dissecting it. But this is a fairly consistent reality. In the garden, were there blessings and curses? How simplified is the structure of the covenant that existed in the garden? What are the rules of the covenant between God and creation? What is man supposed to be doing?
Caring for the garden, not eat of the tree in the midst of the garden.
Right, so you need to go do these things. Don't do that thing. And the blessing is relational. The blessing is you get to stay in the proximity and space of God. And failure to follow the covenant means that you will then be expelled. You'll be kicked out. And that's the outcome. And the outcome of being expelled came with a series of curses, some of which we'll talk about during our worship this morning. So our goal then is to take this reality, a reality where we have a law that's been given. We have history that weaves through that law at different parts. And I'll probably say this a lot. We need to be very careful to keep separate the recorded culture of the Bible's peoples and God's holy standards. Those are wildly different things. Just because someone did a thing in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament does not necessarily mean that that's a thing that God approved of. It also doesn't mean it's a thing he disapproved of, because that's a separate process to reason that out. How many killings are there in the Bible? Is there a little or a lot by your standard?
A lot.
There's a whole lot. Are every single one of those sanctioned or unsanctioned? See, I only gave you two answers, right?
Some of both.
Some of both, right? So you got to use some discernment. The same thing is true with people who worship God. There are lots of people who approach God with worship, with a heart of service, but not all of them do so in ways that match God's expectation. So we discern that. We use determined process of using our intellect, using what we already know, and we start sorting through, much like someone who's digging for gold. They get out their pan, they know that there's gold coming out of that minerals, cascade up the river, and it's tumbled down, and if they just sift long enough, the sparkles will show up. And that's kind of what we do with Bible study. So what we're going to try to do now is expand that a little bit. And you'll get this map next week as part of your handouts, or you can get it in your material if you want to get it that way. I've used it before in classes as well. This process of digging for gold and refining out these details should improve our understanding of all of these Bible stories. Because we'll be able to make some connections that cannot be made unless we know where the thing is. So years ago, I spent a summer preaching in St. Croix. Stayed with Tall and Dana Burke there and did some work. And the Bulls were going to be playing in the playoffs while I was there. And the Burkes did not have any kind of satellite cable service. And I'm like, I don't like to watch the game. And he's like, well, you need to go down to this restaurant on the other side of the island. And I'm like, okay, cool. How do I get there? He's like, well, here's the keys. Okay, I get that this is a small place, but if you just give me these keys, I'm just going to wander the island all night. So he's like, well, you get down, you go down this road, and you turn at the tree. I'm like, the tree? The tree. And then you're going to turn right at the only intersection on that part of the island. And then the place will be on your left, about 2 minutes, 3 minutes down the road. Those directions make zero sense anywhere else, right? But it just so happens that on the stretch of road, there literally was only one tree. And it was the tree. And there's no signs, there's no nothing. You just turn there, and you turn at the next intersection. A lot of the Bible's stories function in much the same way, where you'll have places that have similar names. Sometimes people who have similar names. Sometimes places have the same name, and the people involved have the same name, but they're two different stories and two different people. And that's not an uncommon thing in history. How many places do you know across the globe that are named Alexandria? Al, you know a couple?
Egypt.
There's one in Egypt. Is there any in the United States?
Virginia.
Yeah, there's okay, and how many Parises are there? There's only two that count. There's actually three.
Texas.
There's Paris, Texas. There's Paris, France. And there's Paris, Tennessee, where they have a miniature Eiffel Tower. All right? So that kind of gives us an idea that we're familiar with this. And by the way, sometimes those names get changed because Alexandria becomes Kandahar. To a degree. Has multiple names, multiple languages, does the same things that Jesus does. His name changes through the languages. So we have that kind of reality. So a map like this then gives us the capacity to see some things, to understand some things. Across the course of all these things, we're going to have some, we'll call them rules, but they're more like principles we already know. And just kind of remind ourselves of how these things function. I saw a note a couple weeks ago. How many of you have traveled across a state using a map you purchased by the brand of like Rand McNally or a similar band, and you had that in your car? How many of you have made a journey like that? How many of you crossed the United States using a map like that? Yeah, right? How many of you still travel exclusively using a printed map? Bobby's like, I got you. Bobby still does it. Bobby Saul also uses the mailman's map. I think it gets inserted in their brain when they take on that task. Let's kind of like log it in. I like having a physical map. A lot of times when we go backpacking, I'll make a couple copies. I keep mine and I stick one on somebody else, so I can kind of look at it. No batteries needed. We pull it out. So that means we've got to remind ourselves of some skills that may be a little bit rusty. Maps are always, U.S. maps are always printed this way, to my knowledge. That is, the words, however they're written, are oriented so you can read them when north is north. All right? Even if there's labels on the side and some graphic artist got weird or something and they decided not to put the compass rose on there, the big labelings are written in such a way that when you lay it down, the top of that page should be north. Some of our maps are going to require to use a skill which you may have forgotten. Who can describe for me what those letters and numbers are across the top and sides of a map? So that's in the legend, yeah, and distance.
Well, they're you have an index or whatever you want to call it at the back that tells you the name of the town, and you use those letters to find pinpoint it.
Right, it's like bingo. Like, okay, E4. That means you got to go on the E list over, and then down on the 4, and then they triangulate or coordinate right there. That's a skill that still gets used. A lot of U.S. government service maps still use that same grid system. They don't use the alphabetic thing as much. They'll use the coordinates, but it's still a functional thing. Just like our maps, you're going to have, in all of the maps we look at, the ability to look and discern between cities, streets, major sites or places, and our maps do the same thing. And so our U.S. maps kind of function in that same regard. Always do this when you see a new map. Look for the title. That will tell you what the map is designed to do. It's got a purpose, it's got a reason. It will also give us a picture of how big it is. If it's a little map for a little bit of area, it's often going to have some fine details that won't be explored in a large state map, and some of our maps are there. Donna mentioned this earlier. You've got to look for some of the details around the scaling of the miles and whether this map is designed to teach about politics or maybe the geopolitical aspects of conflict or the geology. Some of the maps we'll look at will do that. Here's what's going on in a comparative couple of maps. So you'll notice that the first map we've already seen shows kind of these geographical regions as delineated between the coastal plain, the hill country, the Jordan Valley, and the Transjordan Plateau. That gives us a hint as to what's going on, but not the only thing that's there, because in Palestine, Israel, or that Middle Eastern region, we got a lot of stuff going on that map. It shows us some of the waterways, some of the lakes, Dead Sea, and then the Sea of Gennesaret, or the Sea of Galilee. But the map next to it gives us a highly refined topography of the region. And so we can tell what's high, what's low, but it also indicates to us where someone might want to live. I'll tell you, if you want to pick where you want to live, you want to be living somewhere between, on this map, the Sea of Galilee and north towards Dan, because that's got all the fertile land to grow and live on, and you can still fish in the Sea of Galilee. If you go try to live by the Dead Sea, you're not going to make it. Without shipping and modern concerns, there are some orchards about 20 minutes away from the Dead Sea. They're not enough to keep you alive for very long. They're more of an agricultural research site. We're trying to replicate and reproduce some of the dates from that era. All right, so that kind of scoots me forward. Maps are also important for you and I, because even if you've traveled to a place before, you kind of forget where things are. The scale of things change as your memory adjusts. And so what once was a quick journey becomes a long one. Growing up, the route from my home to my elementary school seemed really long. A lot of times I'd ride the bus. Sometimes I'd take my trombone and strap it to the front of my bicycle and bike all the way to the elementary school. And that seemed like such a long ride and a long bus ride. It's like 2 miles, and like takes on a bike, it's probably like a 10-minute bike ride. Not a big deal, especially when you're young. It's a little longer now. And in the car, like you're there and you're done. Like it's not that big. But when I was little, that was like so far away. And it must have been uphill both ways. It literally was not. It's flat the entire way. But it feels that way. And so having a map helps us reconnect with that reality. Connecting it within the context of the scriptures, remember, one of the reasons we're doing this is to make what God calls the reason, in part, that we read back into these stories more real. We want this hope that these Old Testament stories to tell us about to sink in well, to actually resonate with us. Do you know any families whose kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids have all gone to the same schools, same colleges? I know a few who have a big legacy. Most of them live in Texas, and most of their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids went to A&M. That's my people, my region of folks that I know. I'm sure you can find other places. So when they go to, let's say, a football game as a family, they're all tied into it. Everybody has a rooted nature into that experience that is very different, perhaps, than somebody else's who didn't have that same kind of knitting together and it's that level of unfamiliarity with everything. If you go with them, you're an onlooker. You're not a participant because you don't know where things are, what's going on. You're just kind of following. This kind of study, in part, should help us improve the tendrils of our information into the structure of the story of the scriptures. So that when we talk about the arrival of the Messiah and how he was effectively born out of the history of Israel, we have a better sense of that. We have a better sense of what it meant for the people of his immediate earthly family to travel from Jerusalem to Egypt. We have a sense of what it was like for the Israelites to wander in the wilderness. We have a sense of what it was like to connect more clearly to the conquest and understand the mechanics of that endeavor by seeing it. And when the gospel goes forth from Jerusalem and Paul's talking about his journeys and we have questions about, hey, why did he do this then? And why did he say that? Sometimes it has very much to do with where he is, where he was, and where he's going. And those things are easily seen, in part, by catching on to some of this in a physical sense with maps. So I did a little thing funny. Some of us have kids in the congregation who are actually going to be studying the same material. And if you're having a student in school somewhere, at the beginning of a semester, they always send home packets with stuff the parents had to sign. And says, yeah, I saw that. I signed it. I saw your little form. Yes, teacher, he got all this stuff. I know they're going to do this homework. So I almost made it so that your kids had to, for some of you, had to sign your syllabuses before you could participate in class, but you don't have to do that. But I do want this. I do think it's really important for us to be participants at home. Bible study a lot of times in adult classes is we went home and we read the lesson and I stared at the question page and I got it. Or I thought about this a lot. This class is a little bit different, where on a regular basis, once or twice per month or more, you're going to have a map that you got to sit down and interact with. in order for you to get the most out of this class, you got to interact with those maps. You got to sit down and stare at them and draw to the best of your ability. Realize nobody's going to be grading that but you. You get to see your maps. I'm not going to take a look at them. Those are all for your benefit, but you'll get the most out of the time we put together if you put the time into that study. We're going to talk about this last thing. So you were handed out, I think it was James handed out the quiz sheets. They've got 21 things on the boxes. So get those pieces of paper out right now that have 21 possibilities. Here's what you got to do. Doing your best. So it's a single page that just has 21 events laid out there. By doing your best, try to put them in order. 1 to 21. And you got 2 minutes to try. Remember, you're the only one grading. I guarantee you, you won't get them all done or accurate between now and then. It's okay. This is for you to kind of check and see where you can remember. You should get some of them. Some of them are pretty easy, but some of them are going to require you to kind of flex around a little bit to make it happen. All right, you can all look up. Wherever you're at, it's fine. Everything else is up here. So those who peeked early, you saw me putting the numbers up there on the screen. Don't be overly concerned if you didn't get any of them done in time that you would like. If you got 5 or 6 right, 12 right, it's fine. Because in some degree, we're trying to help do something quick. Your brain may not be accustomed to it. We get into habit spaces. What we're going to try to do is to use some different learning mechanics to make it easier. The first time I did this class for myself as a self-studied participant, when I did this self-test, I think I got about 7 of them in order in that time frame because I gave myself just a little bit of time to do it. And even now, I have to stop and think before I write. And so it takes me time. But we're going to try to create some opportunities in the course of this to make it easier and quicker. And then it will help us when we're having a Bible study with someone that isn't familiar with the Bible. If we're working with our own faith, if we're simply just reading the Bible, we'll remember where all this stuff fits in together. And so you can take this same list here and switch it around, and it actually becomes a little bit easier if you put it in a chronological order this way and kind of lay it out sequentially. We're also, in the course of all of this, going to introduce Bob Waldron and his wife Sandra, who wrote this material, they also have a little thing called the 3-cycle approach, which takes the story of the Bible and breaks it down into 17 distinct time periods. And so on a regular basis, we'll bring up those 17 time periods. But as I mentioned, next week we're going to be talking about Palestine. And so you're going to start paying attention to how this region becomes the central physical space for the bulk of the story of God's people. Everything centers around a very small part of the physical space of creation. Palestine's not a big region, but a whole lot of things happen there for a lot of reasons. There are massive empires that swirl through it that all have an impact on the story of God's people. From the early Greco and Greek experiences that start around 300 or 400 BC to the Greco-Roman shift that takes place prior to the arrival of Christ, and even onto the two wings of the Roman Empire, which really continue well into the modern era. They just changed their name a couple of times. And so the Roman influence that is rooted around all of these Bible stories actually finds its way incrementally, not only into how we read the Bible today, but also our culture today. Some of the things we might even be able to make mention of in the course of our studies. So, covered quite a bit. That's like your typical introduction to a new study. And so the teacher just dumped a bunch of things on your head and gave you a list of stuff to do. You'll also get, once a month, a list of passages to read that coincide to our study. And they'll be adjusted as we go along because our schedule is a bit flexible, even though it's fairly laid out. Any questions? Everyone kind of know what they're going to try to do. So quick reminders, if you want to get a physical copy of the book, I've got a sample here you can look at. There's a link to do so in your email, but there's also a free downloadable one in that same email, and so you can do it either way. Happy to talk with you about that afterwards so you can determine what's best for you. We'll have that schedule that will follow every week so you can make sure that you're getting a good understanding of how all of these stories interact. That's it for our time this morning. Thanks, everybody, and look forward to the study together.